Okay, are you ready for some good news?
Yes.
The reason I ask you if you're ready for some good news is because the good news of the gospel is what preaching is all about. To preach gospel means to preach good news, and so therefore it's important to acknowledge every time that what we're gathering around is good news. I'd like to say a word of welcome to everybody at our Union Cross campus and everybody at Clemens, also the Ascent and others that are joining us by video. We're so glad to be together. We're in the middle of some emphasis on missions tonight. We're talking about the proclamation of the gospel and our joy of being able to support missionaries here and around the world that are proclaiming the gospel. I thought it would just be wonderful to spend some time talking about the absolute beauty and power of the gospel when it is proclaimed in its purity. And we've been looking at this kind of inaugural sermon of Jesus's in Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4, he takes the scroll of Isaiah at verse 17, and he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it's written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And what I'm focusing in on is this: he came to proclaim good news to the poor. And then I want to take you over to tonight to our primary text in Galatians in chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4, verse 8. "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years." He's talking there about you're observing all these Jewish festivals. You feel like you have to legalistically keep the Sabbath or keep certain festivals. You're just kind of going back on this legalism is what he's talking about. Verse 11, he listens to the pain in Paul's heart. "I'm afraid that I may have labored over you in vain." Saying, I thought the gospel had taken root, and now here you've gone back to all of this. And then he continues at verse 21 using an example that we're going to be talking about tonight. "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise." Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She's Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she's in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. Look at verse 28. "Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman." He's referring back to a story in Genesis, and we're going to be looking at that in a few moments, and all this is going to make sense, because at first, unless you're real familiar with the stories, it wouldn't make much sense. But you can see this is one of the most powerful and poignant images Paul ever uses to describe how beautiful, wonderful, and radical the gospel of the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ really is. Many years ago, my wife and I hosted a young adults group at our home. And as we were just getting started, the second week that we were meeting, and I didn't know all of these young adults that were coming. I was just beginning to get to know them. And the second week we were meeting, we'd already started our meeting. The front doorbell rang, and I went to get the door. And there on my front porch steps was a highway patrolman in full uniform. And my heart sank, and I could feel a little fear just came up within me. And my thought was, well, I haven't even been driving here in a while. How could I be getting a ticket now? And then I started thinking, what else could I have done wrong? And why would he even be here? And I just said, yes, sir, this young man. And he said, hey, Pastor Alan. He said, I'm Randy. He said, I'm here for the Bible study. I said, oh, Randy. He said, yeah, I'm sorry. I'd been in uniform. I just got off duty. And I said, oh, come on in, man. Yeah, sure. And I thought, until I knew that he was my friend, I thought he was going to give me a ticket. In other words, you see what seems to be the symbol of the law, and you immediately start thinking about what might be condemning me. And a lot of people, this is the way they've come to view the church, is that if there was someone who were representing God, then I have a little fear that comes up. Some kind of condemnation is going to be coming soon. In his very good book, What's So Amazing About Grace, Phil Yancey tells about a friend who had a ministry amongst people who were on the streets of Chicago, and one woman who had been selling herself on the streets of Chicago, and this friend of Yancey's was trying to help her. And at one point, the friend asked this woman on the streets of Chicago, said, have you ever thought about going to church? And she said, church? She said, I already feel terrible about myself. She said, they would just make me feel worse. And whatever's happened, especially in our culture, there's a lot of sentiment and misunderstanding a lot of people have that think that that's what church is about, or even what gospel is about, or what the word evangelical is about, which is based on the word that means gospel. And so tonight we're going to be diving deep into not just asking what does the gospel really mean, but why is it that Paul is so upset with the Galatians, and he's speaking so strongly. He is saying that the gospel cannot be infected with any law-based living, or else it is like introducing a persecution spirit right into the midst of the home, in the way that happened with Ishmael and Isaac. And we'll explain that. It is for our purposes, as we think about gospel proclamation that we love supporting all over the world, to clarify what we really mean by preaching. I was a little disappointed, not a little, a lot disappointed, in looking up Merriam-Webster's definition of the word preach. I'm a preacher, and the first definition is plain vanilla, to deliver a sermon. But listen to the second definition: to urge acceptance of an idea or course of action. So far so good, I guess. But then it says specifically, to exhort in an officious or tiresome manner. That's what people think it means to preach. It's like somebody, if somebody's going through a hard time, or they feel like they're trapped in some kind of sinful behavior, and somebody starts talking, and they're like, oh, don't preach to me. Last thing I need is somebody preaching at me. Now, we don't understand that the word preach that is used in Luke 4, when Jesus takes that scroll from Isaiah, the word for preach is a word that is to say proclaim good news. Let me show you this to make sure that we get this straight. Proclaim good news is the Greek word euangelizomai. And euangelizomai comes from the euangelion. This is the evangel. This is the euangelion is the Greek word for good news, and that's our word for gospel. So to preach is to euangelizomai. It is to proclaim the euangelion. It is to proclaim good news. There's a word, euangelion. It comes from this prefix EU. You see this in things like a eulogy, right? Eulogy comes from the words EU, like good, and logos, word. It's like to give a good word about somebody. And the second part of the evangelion is just angelos, which is messenger. Angel means messenger. So that's what this means. It means that it is the proclamation of a good news announcement. And the comparable word in the Old Testament, basar, was a word that was just used to announce something like the birth of a child or the victory of a battle. It's one of the most wonderful words. It's the announcement of good news. But what Paul is going to say is, as we're going to see, is that when you start mixing in any law, then you introduce this unlimited capacity for fear and condemnation, and the good news loses its goodness. And that's the problem in Galatia. So here's what happened. Paul had preached the gospel. It was received with great joy there amongst the Galatian Christians. They were filled with the Spirit. They had miracles in their midst. It was a wonderful gospel community. And then these Judaizers had entered the scene. Now, it's a word that is used to describe false teachers who came in and began to try to convince the converts in Galatia that in order to be a true great Christian, that you not only needed what Jesus had done and accept it by faith, you need that, but in addition to that, they said there are other things. If you want to really be close to God, then you'll keep certain days and you'll legalistically keep the festivals, and specifically, they said, and you'll keep practicing the Jewish ritual of circumcision. And Paul is just furious about this, and you wonder, why is he so mad? Until you realize that what Paul is mad about is that when you introduce any mixture into the gospel where it's like, yes, it's about Jesus and what he's done for me, but it's also a little bit about what I need to do. Now you've got a mixed message, and it's paralyzing. And even worse than that, it is poisonous to the soul. That's essentially what he's saying. I had an opportunity to be going down to Moultrie, Georgia earlier this week to speak at a banquet there. As a church there in Moultrie that I did a conference a couple years in a row, maybe a decade ago. And I hold that church in my heart. And so they invited me back to come down and speak at an event at a counseling center. And so I said, sure, I'll come. Well, it's long story short, it's hard to get to Moultrie, Georgia on airplanes. I was kind of tired. I was coming back home, and my flight had a connection in Charlotte to get back in and go to Raleigh and then drive home to Raleigh. And by this time, I'm getting kind of tired on Tuesday. And I get into the Charlotte airport. We were a little bit late, and I realized I was going to have to run to make my connection. And I'm getting too old for this stuff, running through airports. But I said, okay, I'm going to run. And I had received a text on my phone that said that the airplane was going to be at gate D1. But I always like to check the monitor at the airport, right? Anybody of you guys that travel, check the monitor, because the monitor is what's the live thing, right? So I checked the monitor. It said C19. Which is it? D1 or C19? And my plane had just gated at E28, which in the Charlotte airport is as far away as you can get. They need to have a train or a bus from E28, but they don't. And so I just said, I got to make a decision here, and I don't know what to do. I'm just going to run for C19 because that's what the monitor says. I stopped 2 other times, checked C19. Every monitor in the Charlotte Douglas International Airport said C19 for my flight. And I literally ran. I'm sweating, I'm huffing, I'm puffing, and I got to the C concourse in 19s at the end. As the last one down there. And so I went down, and there I saw that, there were some people boarding and so forth. And it said Newark. And I was trying to remember that not just was I a preacher, but I was a Christian. I was forgetting all of that about that time. And I said something like, every monitor in the airport says C19, and now I might miss my flight. Please call over there. It didn't maybe come quite as nicely as, that's a mixed message, right? I did make the flight. I ran to D1 as they were closing the gate. And a mixed message is a message that will have you left worried and weary. Psychologists talk about in some of our parenting or our relationships that somebody want what we call a double bind. And double bind message is where I don't know, let's say the child spills milk and mom says, I love you, but really, it's a double message. Okay, do you love me, or am I less loved because I spilled the milk? And so it leaves you wondering a little bit about that. It's like saying, I don't know, I feel trapped here between two things. And what Paul's saying is that I came and I preached to you a gospel that was the good news of what God's done for you in Jesus Christ, so that it is not about your merits, it's not about your righteousness, it's not about you keeping any laws, because you can't manage to keep the law by your own power. And now these false teachers have come in and you've begun believing this, and you're starting succumbing to this. And what's happening with this is it is leaving you with this mixed message, and the very power of the gospel is being eroded from you. And what Paul's concerned about is that as soon as you have a mixture of the gospel, then it introduces the capacity for fear to come into your life in a whole new way. Because if you are wondering whether you're keeping the little bit of the law that you're supposed to, even though it's mostly gospel, it can just rob you of the joy you have in the gospel. I remember some years ago reading about a father who was emotionally distant from his son, and sometimes abusive to the son, but the boy loved fishing. And the only thing they ever did together was sometimes they'd go fishing together. And he'd had this rod and reel that he wanted so badly. And his birthday rolled around, and his dad came and gave him a rod and reel. But as he gave him the rod and reel, he said, now I expect you to be sure and have all your chores done on time. And remember, he said as he's walking away, he said, I gave it to you. I can always take it away from you. And the little boy said, in reflection on it, writing many years later, he said, I almost didn't want the gift because I was so afraid of losing it. When you introduce law, even if it's like gospel, 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 good news, good news, good news, but then you introduce the bad news of, but if you're not good enough and you don't measure up, then maybe you won't have all the affection of God. If you introduce that, even though you might talk a lot about the grace of God, you have infected it, and it's like poison into the whole system. Our radio ministry that is through Sharing the Light Ministries is celebrating 10 years, and we're very thankful. Reynolda Church has a strategic partnership with Sharing the Light Ministry, and so we're celebrating 10 years of radio ministry. And one of the things we've been doing is just going back and looking at some of the letters of encouragement and testimonies over the last 10 years. It's a very encouraging thing to do, to see people all around the nation that have been receiving this message through radio. But as we began that first year, I was looking back over this and saw a note that really, in some ways, it haunted me and also motivated me, because we received it, I think, in the first year we were on the radio. It was from a man named Herman, and he wrote this note and said, I love the Lord, and I want to grow in His grace and knowledge. My only desire is to please God, but I know that I come up short. Did I say the right words at the right time when I tried to witness to someone? Did I study God's Word long enough? Did I pray right? He writes, I witness every chance I get. I study the Word 1 to 2 hours a day. I listen to preaching and teaching on the radio, but I still feel guilty of not giving the Lord enough when I think of what Jesus has done for me. I'm 60 years old, he wrote, but I cry often because I can never do enough for the Lord. Pray for me. That kind of slavery and bondage is what Paul's talking about. It gets introduced when you start introducing. But it's more than just fear that gets introduced when you start introducing legalism into the gospel. It's not just that you become afraid or that you feel paralyzed by a mixed message. It's that it becomes part of your identity. And this is the worst part of all. I've been reading a book by a woman named Tara Westover. It's a New York Times #1 bestseller. She was raised in a strange home in Idaho, in which her parents were very strict Mormons who had a survivalist ideology and hoarded oil and food, and believed there was a big conspiracy and that they needed to keep their children from the outside world. And so, for example, Tara didn't even have a birth certificate until it was needed much later in her life, and she was able to finally get one. But they said they homeschooled, but they didn't offer any education. They had a junkyard, and the kids were expected to work in the junkyard, and where they were injured often. And they believed medical practice was bad and evil, so when they were injured, they wouldn't get medical help. And instead, they did home remedies. And her older brother was abusive towards her, and this is all she knew. But she, under a series of encouragement from one of her older brothers who had sort of broken out of this system, she taught herself enough about reading and arithmetic to eventually take the standardized ACT test. And after the second attempt, she was admitted to Brigham Young University. And she began to study. She said in her first, for example, in one of her first courses, there was some mention very quick about the Holocaust, and she raised her hand and said, "What's the Holocaust?" She was, turned out, very, very bright. And she studied hard as she could. And eventually one of her professors at Brigham Young said that he wanted her to apply for a Cambridge scholarship. And she did. And she went to Cambridge to study. And she wrote an essay for a professor that she'd worked on very, very hard, and submitted it. And I want to read to you what she wrote. "I finished the essay and sent it to Professor Steinberg. 2 days later, when I arrived for our next meeting, he was subdued. He peered at me from across the table. I wanted for him to say the essay was a disaster, the product of an ignorant mind, that it had overreached, drawn too many conclusions from too little material. I've been teaching in Cambridge for 30 years, he said, and this is one of the best essays I've read." Listen to what she wrote. "I was prepared for insults, but not for this. Professor Steinberg must have said more about the essay, but I heard nothing. My mind was consumed with a wrenching need to get out of that room. I could tolerate any form of cruelty better than kindness. Praise was a poison to me. I choked on it. I wanted the professor to shout at me. I wanted it so deeply I felt dizzy from the deprivation. The ugliness of me had to be given expression." When there's a mixed message, it's paralyzing because it's so confusing. It introduces fear, which brings slavery. But believed long enough, it becomes part of your identity. And maybe what Paul's most concerned about in the Galatian situation was, above and beyond all that, it means the loss of power. He says elsewhere in this epistle, he said, you start out in the Spirit, and now you return back to works of the flesh? You really are moving in that direction? Who has bewitched you? Because the power of the gospel is in this, that we knowing that we have no power in ourselves to fulfill righteousness or keep the law, that we humbly yield ourselves to the grace of God and count on Him and trust in His promises. And as we do that and we trust in Christ, therein, in that submission and that deep worship, that's where we are empowered. We are filled with the Spirit when we are submitted in worship to God. Inasmuch as we are trying it by our own effort, we effectively close down our hearts to the very gift of the Spirit that God wants to continually pour out in our lives. So what Paul's saying is that there's not really an in-between here, because once you infect the gospel with law-based thinking, whether it be you got to keep this day a festival, or you got to circumcise your children, you got to keep these rituals, or whether it be the strange environment that Tara Westover grew up in of legalism, whether it be once you introduce that into it, you have moved, Paul says, instead of relying on the promises of God, you're now relying on your own strength. And that's anti-gospel. And to explain this, he draws upon this poignant, familiar image in the Old Testament that all the Jewish believers would have fully understood immediately. He was talking about one of the most important stories. God had come to Abraham and promised that he and his wife Sarah were going to have a son in their old age. But they didn't have a son for years after that. And in their impatience, they started thinking, well, maybe God wants us to do something about this. And so they agreed that they would bring in Hagar, who was the maidservant, a slave woman in the house, that she would come and be a surrogate mother, and that she could mother a child for Abraham. And so that's what they did. So here's what happened. I won't turn you there, but listen in on this. Genesis 16. Now Sarai, she wasn't yet, her name gets changed to Sarah. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, and maybe I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, listen to this, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So as soon as Hagar, the maidservant, is pregnant with Abraham's child, she now starts hating Sarah. And Hagar looking down on Sarah. At verse 6 of that chapter, Abram said to Sarah, behold, your servant is in your power, do as you please. And Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So now Sarah is retaliating toward the bad treatment the maidservant's given her, and so there's this terrible conflict. And God said to Abram at chapter 17, verse 5, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarah, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I'll give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. And the text says at verse 17, Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. So Abraham says, listen, we've got Ishmael. There's no way a 100-year-old, 90-year-old. We tried this the other night for work. And so why don't you just let Ishmael be the one through whom all these promises come? That's what he's saying to him. And God said, verse 19, no. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I'll establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. So, verse 5 of chapter 21, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh over it. And so that's why Isaac was named Isaac. It means laughter. And she said, who would have said to Abraham and Sarah would nurse children, yet I've borne him a son in his old age? Here's what happened. Verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing, mocking. See, he's much older, and he's mocking this little half-brother of his. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for this son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And so they send off Hagar and Ishmael. And Paul has grabbed hold of this story to say, I want to show you something about the gospel. And it's an interesting story because it seems unfair at first to Hagar and Ishmael. I mean, after all, it wasn't Hagar's idea, it was Sarah's idea. And now Hagar's going to be put out. And Abraham doesn't really want to put her out, but God says, you do what Sarah said and get rid of that slave woman out of your house. The problem with Ishmael is that he wasn't the son of promise, and God had given a promise. And he's like, the power of my word is the thing that matters here. And we're not going to put on display, and we're not going to send forth this blessing through any human effort through this slave woman. It's an interesting text, that story. It would be so fascinating to talk about all the dimensions, but one that jumps out at me, Isaac means laughter. Abraham and Sarah both had laughed when God had given them this message because it was the laughter of the hilarity of the gospel of grace, of God doing the impossible. But then there's another place where there's laughter, and it's Ishmael now laughing mockingly. It's like saying you're either laughing with humility and joy at the gospel, or you're laughing with pride and disdain. And Paul takes this and he applies this like an allegory to say this all took place so that you could see how important it is that you have no law mixed into the gospel of grace. Here's the way if we could look at it this way. It's like you have Hagar and Sarah. And Hagar produces Ishmael, Sarah, Isaac. And he says that Hagar is representative of the old covenant, the covenant of law, whereas Sarah is representative of the new covenant. And therefore Hagar is a picture, he's saying, of law, and Sarah is a picture of grace. Further, what they're saying is that Hagar is a symbol of living by the works of the flesh, which to Paul means human effort that's still rooted in the sin nature. But Sarah is a picture of living by the power of the Spirit, because what happened in her is miraculous by the Spirit. And Hagar is a picture, therefore, of performance or works-based living, and Sarah is a picture of living by the promises of God. And what happens with Hagar and with Ishmael and performance-based living is that it introduces, as we've been speaking about, a life of fear, a life that is continually concerned with the question, have I done enough to be acceptable? If you're going to make the promise of God come to pass by your own efforts, how will you know if you've done enough to make God's promises come true? And so what Paul is saying is that the whole model of this means that you're either going to be in fear or you're going to be, as is symbolized through Sarah, you're going to be in faith. Another way to look at this is that Hagar is all about saying, I'm in control, whereas Sarah is saying, God's in control. Isaac is a picture of God's in control of this, and he was going to bring supernaturally this child to them, but it was going to be in God's timing, and God was in control of it. And that's the thing that gets worrisome to us when it doesn't seem to be happening, and we try to take over. It is the appearance in Hagar of blessing, but in a sense, she's inwardly just bereft of any real blessing. You know, in that culture where it was just such a mark of blessedness to be able to bear a son, and yet Sarah has all these years of having no son, an appearance of being barren and unblessed, but she's actually the one who's blessed. In the end, what it is a picture of the difference between slavery and freedom. The gospel sets you free, and the law will make you a slave. And so what Paul says to the Galatians is, cast out the slave woman and her son. He is saying you not only need to recognize what part of your gospel has been infected with law-based mentalities, but you need to actively get rid of it. You need to know that it will never work to invite legalism into bed with the gospel. It will never work because law mocks grace, and law fights against grace. They might look alike, like they're both sons, but they're totally different. They might say, well, we both law and grace are saying we want to live this wonderful and good and righteous life, but from totally different motivations. So what Paul's saying, the big enemy of the grace of God and his power at work is not really a particular sin. It's not your lust or your deception or your gossip, but you can deal with that. But what the real enemy is the legalism itself. The human attempt to keep the law result in either pride, which says, look how righteous I am, look what I've done, or condemnation. Look what I haven't done, and I'm doomed by my sin. And then Paul takes all this and he says to the Galatians, he says, you just understand who you are as a Christian. You are not an Ishmael. You're an Isaac. It's who you are. How were you born again? By your own effort? No. You were born by the promise of God. You were born by the Spirit of God. You are born again by the grace of God. You are, as a Christian, a supernatural miracle. Every bit as much as Isaac was a miracle. You, as a Christian, you are a supernatural miracle and evidence of the grace of God. You're in an unshakable covenant of grace. You're in a posture of being an heir of God, not a slave. You're not the product of some human effort like Hagar. You are a product of God's goodness and His love. This is who you are, and God is going to build His kingdom through you. So you got to get rid of the slave woman so you can welcome every day of your life the work of the Spirit. So you can live by the promises of God. And that proclamation, that announcement of the good news of what God's done for us in Jesus Christ, that is what it means to preach. Preach means to tell somebody the good news. And it is the great joy of our lives. And that's what we do as a church, and that's what we want to support here and all around the world. I hate to say, but it wasn't the only time I ran through the airport this week. I had a time that was more anxiety producing running at the airport on the way down to Moultrie, Georgia. Y'all, I almost missed my flight. And the bad thing about it was there was no plan B. There were no other flights to get me down to Tallahassee in time. I couldn't jump in the car and drive the 8 hours down there in time. I was just going to miss it if I missed the flight. And it was a rough day. I left a little later from home to go to Raleigh-Durham Airport than I should have, and I put it on the GPS, and my heart just absolutely sank because there was some kind of traffic jam on I-40, and it said it was going to take me a half hour longer than I thought. And I thought, well, it'll clear up. It didn't clear up. I had to be rerouted through Durham and down the Durham Freeway. And I got there. I literally parked as far away from Terminal 2 as I could be. And I ran from my car to security check-in saying, please don't let it be long. Please don't let it be long. And y'all, it's about as long as I've ever seen it before. And I stood there in line. It's a terrible feeling to sit there and think, I am the program tonight. And all these people gathering for this big banquet, and there is no plan B, and I might miss this flight. It is a terrible feeling. I made it by literally 1 minute. They were closing the door behind me, and kind of, and so the whole trip, I'm just like back and forth. I'm like, man, this is tough. I didn't get to go by Starbucks and get me a coffee there in the terminal, and all of this. And I've been bemoaning all week how grueling my flights were getting back and forth to Moultrie. And then yesterday I got email from Stephen Banda, who is a pastor, a missionary we support in Malawi for the better part of a couple decades. He said, pray for him, said he was going to go and preach in Mozambique. And so we prayed for him, and he sent word back, and he said it went really well. He said, just pray for me that I'll get a better bus going back. He mentioned offhandedly that he had to stand for 7 hours on the bus going because there were no seats. So there's a little difference there between our travel problems, and he loves to preach. It's interesting that the idea of euangelizomai, the proclamation of the good news, was often used to speak of the message of victory in a battle. And the one who carried that message, the one who shared that good news, was much celebrated. How blessed are the feet of him who brings good news. The word euangelizomai means there's a message, and it's coming from the battle scene to tell us that we've won. And that is the message of the good news of the victory of Jesus Christ for us. We just preach it and say, Jesus has won. And that's the gospel.